Okay. Not bad for an old guy. Budgets and taxes. First, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. You know my name. My name's Mike Watson. But in terms of budgets and taxes, I worked for Navistar International Transportation Corporation, formerly International Harvester, for 30 years. And for the last 20 years that I worked there, I was in a management position in one form or another. And at the end, I was responsible for the corporate data center and some remote sites. So I had multiple departments working for me, and I had budgetary responsibilities of expense in the vicinity of $5 million a year, and I had capital expense anywhere from $200 to $12 million a year. Now, that doesn't mean anything, really, except that I have some experience in this sphere. Now, my experience was on the business side, and in the accounting system on local governments, it's a little bit different. Not terribly different, but a little different. In any event, that's my background. So I'm going to talk about budgets and taxes, and I'm going to talk about taxes first. Understanding your taxes is one incredibly daunting, complex topic. However, at a summary level, there are some things that are easily understood and verifiable, and I would encourage you at the end of tonight to go home and look at some things on your tax bill. The good news is that most of us have received lower taxes this year. But of course the question really is, why? If you just look at the bottom number on your tax bill, it's not going to give you enough information. You're going to have to look at the details. It's important to understand at least that surface level. However, it is by far more important to think about where we are going as a community. I presume you all know this, but your tax bills are public records and they're available on the internet. I can look at yours, you can look at mine. And I've got, I don't know, I must have 70 or 80 tax bills that I've gone through here over the last week collecting and preparing some of this information that you're about to see. For the village of Richfield, however, we really have 4 different tax bills here, and that's because we have 4 different school districts. This represents everybody in this room's taxes, as near as I can tell. If you look at your tax bill when you get home, and I strongly encourage you to do so, just as verification that what you heard is accurate tonight, you will see that your state tax went down by 4.4%. You'll see that your county tax went down by 3.4%. You'll see that the village of Richfield tax went up by 0.6%. And the rest is all schools. Now the highlights in the schools are Freeze Lake, which went down by 24.5% because they paid off their debt. And Hartford did a pretty good job. Their taxes went down by 6%. From here, I'm going to transition into budget. But just before I do, I want to set the stage. Essentially, all communities operate and perform their budget planning this way. The first step is to go through and figure out what your expenses are going to be. After you've determined what your expenses are going to be, your next step is to determine where are you going to get all of that revenue to support those expenses. Because they operate on a modified cash accrual accounting system, they have to get the cash coming in to pay the expense of their budget, unlike a business which doesn't operate that way. Now what does that mean? That means that when you look at the revenue side of the budget, you're going to see that there's probably about a dozen line items there, maybe more, that represent all the revenue that the village collects. However, when you look at those line items, keep in mind that the last line item, which is going to represent the taxes that you are going to pay through your real estate taxes, is calculated after everything else is determined, so you fill in the blanks. You fill in the space. And what I'd like you to remember from this piece right now is that the budget that is planned has a significant influence on the taxes that you're going to pay. There'll be a quiz later on that one. So now let's look at 1 year sample of the budget revenue plan from the Village of Richfield's budget for 2011. The first thing you're going to spot, I'm sure, is that nice big blue section. Who is that? It's yours. This big blue pie, thing that shows up on your real estate taxes that has the line item next to it, Village of Richfield. That's where that money comes from. So in the year 2011, the thing you should understand is that your real estate property tax bill provided 66% of the revenue for the Village of Richfield's budget. That's a pretty big number. The second thing, though, that's not quite so obvious, is this spot right over here. That is a 7% contribution from the reserve fund, which I'm going to explain to you what that is and why you care about it in just a minute. That is additional revenue that came into the budget to accommodate the demand for money for all of the expense they were going to have, and the reserve fund money is your money that you have paid in prior years, and you want to pay attention to that. So that means for the year 2011, you paid 73% of the village's budget to operate. 73%. Now let's take a look for a moment at the Richfield annual budget, just for grins and giggles. If you take a look at 2003, and I hope you can all see and read this from back there, you'll see that the Village of Richfield budget was somewhere in the vicinity of $2.3 million. And if you look to the right, you'll see in 2012 it was 3.8. In 2013 it's about 3, 5.5, somewhere in that general vicinity. So we've gone from a budget of $2.3 million to $3.6 million in a matter of 11 years. One of the things that statisticians like to do is to perform regressions analysis, which is an interesting way of concluding with putting a ruler on a piece of paper and drawing the line that best fits through all of the dots. I don't need to pay a statistician to do that. I could get a ruler out and a pen and do that. You can do that here. So your concern should be, as you look at this budget, understanding that your taxes are based on the budget. 77% of it you pay based on the budget. If you put a ruler through that, where do you think that ruler is going to point? It's going to point up. The thing that, thank you, and because I do ask a lot of rhetorical questions. I know the answer, but I'm hoping somebody's paying attention. Thank you. So one of the other things I want to point out is that if you take a look at 2013, there's a pretty significant decline in 2013, and someone might want to argue and say, well, that's the prelude of more declines to come. Maybe it is. My bet would be not, because if you take a look, anytime you take a look at a single data point and you try and influence the trend based on that single data point, you're going to run a high risk that your forecast is wrong. And as an example of that, if you take a look at the difference between, I think that's 2000 and, can't see quite from here, 2008, 2009, here between 2009 and 2010, you see that drop there? So if you wanted to draw your forecast based on that line, well then these lines wouldn't match that, would they? So you really want to look at the big picture if you're trying to make a long-term forecast or projection. Now when I looked at this, I'm really concerned that we're spending so much money in our village. And I haven't parsed this down enough to understand all the details why. I sure would like to, and if you encourage me, I will. But I haven't done it as deep as I want yet. I do have a couple of things that I want to share with you here, and the next one is going to be this. I'm going to take this chart that you're looking at, and it'll transport right into the next slide. It'll have the exact same scaling, it'll have the same color, it'll look almost identical, and the only difference is, instead of having an axis here based on dollars, it'll have an axis based on percent. Now you might be wondering, why did I do that? The reason I did that is because I wanted to compare our budget expense to what's happening, at least with the other two big factors that we all know to be true. One is what's happening with our population, and the other one is what's happening with inflation, or as the government calls it, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So the data at the bottom, the pink line if you will, I got that information directly from the census. It covers from 2000 to 2010, so I took that growth rate that was evident in those years and I just continued that growth rate into 2011, 12, and 13. That's pretty good data. The line immediately above it is the CPI data, which is your inflation index. That came directly out of the federal government's database. The only unusual thing there is for 2013, the only data they had out there was January. but it seems to be in line with all of the other trends here, so I use that. Now, so what does all this mean? What this means is we have a pretty significantly growing budget. That's a pretty big growth. And we can look at these two numbers and we can see it's not because of the population. And we can see it's not because of inflation. That ought to be a concern. It is to me. I mentioned the concept of the reserve fund a little bit ago. You're going to have to wait. It'll be a while because it'll be at the breakout sessions. Good. I mentioned earlier the reference to the reserve fund. And so I want to clarify what this is. The reserve fund is essentially an accounting statement. And it's an accounting statement that records money. And money comes into the reserve fund and money comes out of the reserve fund. So let's talk about how does it get into the reserve fund first. Imagine that in some fiscal year you have expenses of $2.9 million and you have revenues of $3 million. Well, at the end of that year you got $100,000 left, right? What do you do with that $100,000? Not all communities put it in the reserve fund. Some communities just move it into the next fiscal year. We put it in the reserve fund, which is a more popular thing to do. So that's how money gets into the reserve fund. The next question is, how does money get removed from the reserve fund? Well, it's the exact same process. If you remember when we talked about the revenue side of the budget, there's a line item in that budget for withdrawing funds from the reserve fund. Doesn't tell you what it's going to be used for, but it tells you that it's going to withdraw funds from the reserve fund. So that's basically how money gets in and out of the reserve fund. So let's talk a little bit about our reserve fund history. As you can see, in 2001 we had about $750,000 in the reserve fund, and based on an estimate for 2012, because the audited number is not yet available, we're looking at somewhere in the vicinity of $2.25 million or $2.25 million. Our budget is $3.5 million. We almost have a whole year's budget in the reserve fund. At one point in time, I had argued with the village board that they should take some of that money out of the reserve fund and they should use it to lower your taxes. Now, Mr. Showman has accurately and appropriately pointed out to me that there's some real dangers and risk with that, and I have to agree with him on that. However, doesn't mean that you can't take some of it and do something to relieve and lower your taxes. And I think that should be, because there's absolutely no rational reason to have this kind of money in the reserve fund. I was also asked, well, Mike, how much money should we have in the reserve fund? And at that time, I didn't know. I just thought at that time $2 million was just obscene. Subsequent to then I've had a lot of conversations with local communities. The general answer is that most communities run between 10 and 25% of their budget in the reserve fund. We're running at about 65%. I'd also like to point out, you can put your ruler on this slide and you can predict the future. And I think you ought to be concerned about why are they collecting all this money and sticking it in the reserve fund. It doesn't make sense. Now, I'd like you to imagine for a minute that you decided to remodel your kitchen. And in the process of remodeling your kitchen, you've talked to a bunch of contractors and you finally elected one. I like this guy. My neighbors have used him, my friends have used him, he does good work, his price is reasonable, this is the guy. So he comes to your home with a contract for you to sign, and you sign it, and when he gets done with the contract, he says, but I need the check for 10 grand. Well, wait a minute, you haven't done the work yet. Well, you're right, but the only way I do work is if I'm paid up front. I have labor costs, I have material costs, I've got to get my money up front. And you think about it and say, wow, this is a good guy, comes with good reputation, good references, so you pay him the 10 grand. 2 weeks later he starts, 2 months later he's done an outstanding job, the kitchen is just gorgeous, you're incredibly pleased, and he comes back and he says, hey, how do you like what I've done? You say, it's great, really great, thank you very much. By the way, I'm just curious, do you happen to know what all of the costs were for putting in my kitchen? He says, well, as a matter of fact, I do, he said. I don't have it right with me, but I'll come back. I don't mind sharing that with you. I'm an open and honest guy. He comes back a week and a half later and he sits down with you and he shows you all of his costs, and you add them up and it's $8,000. Ha! And that included his profit margin. And you say, whoa, that's really great. When do I get my $2,000 back? Well, you don't. Well, why not? Because I put it in my reserve fund. That's exactly what's going on here. That's exactly what's going on here. So now, to put some perspective on all of these numbers. For the years 2009 through 2012, you have 4 columns here for each year. The first one is the budget plan. The second one is the actual expense. The third one is the actual revenue. And the fourth one is the end of year reserve fund balance. From here, you get a really good picture of what's going on financially. Now, there's some things that should leap out at you, and I know would if you took the time to study this a little bit. So I'm going to point a couple of those out. The first thing is, for each of these years, you should note that the budget plan, which is expense, was more than the actual expense. Now, I suppose that there's 2 arguments. You could say, hey, they've done a really good job at managing down their expense. Maybe that's true. Apparently they do it every year. Would think that we'd get them all done and we wouldn't have to do that every year. The other opportunity is perhaps the budget was overstated in the first place, which frankly is my leaning. The second thing to look at here is for each year you can see that with the exception of 2011, I'm going to specifically talk about that. For each year you can see that the actual revenue was greater than the actual expense. So if the revenue is greater than the expense, I'm sorry. Is that a question? Yeah. If the actual revenue is greater than the actual expense, that means you have money left over, right? And where does that money go? Bingo. So every year this money goes into the reserve fund, and while this is a graphical representation, you can look at the hard details, and this is exactly what they are. Now, that's true for every year except 2011. 2011 I find really interesting, and here's why. In 2011, the Village of Richfield planned, it's in the budget, to withdraw $266,000 from the reserve fund, but they never drew it. They never took it. They never used it. So if you look at the actual expense and the actual revenue for that year, they're about the same. There's a difference of about $30,000, which, as near as I can tell, is all associated with Act 10, Governor Walker's effort. But that $266,000 troubled me, so I looked a little deeper. And as I looked a little deeper, guess what account was short $233,000 in terms of that account's planned expense and actual expense? Road repair and maintenance. So that was a year that we planned to spend an additional $230,000 on road repair and maintenance, and we elected to not do it. That's subsequently been followed by a release of information from the village, including an article in the West Bend Daily News that says we're in trouble keeping our roads repaired and maintained, and one of the 4 options presented was to increase your tax rate by 50%. I got a little problem with that. First one is, why aren't you spending what you've already planned on spending, and why don't you use some of the money out of the reserve fund before you tell me that I have to increase my taxes? I'm almost done. The other topic that you're going to hear about tonight is sewer and water. And I'm going to broach that topic only from a big picture financial perspective. And here's what I've done, or we've done. We went through all of our neighboring communities, and we found each neighboring community and identified whether they had sewer and water, and then we went back and found out by what percentage. This first slide represents communities with sewer and water. Every one of these communities listed has sewer and water. And all of their mill rates or tax rates are charted. And you can see the highest is about $8 and the lowest is about $4. And you can see the average, which is that red line in the center, is about $6. That's the tax rate for communities with municipal sewer and water that are our neighbors, and that's all of them. So then your next question is going to be, well, tell me about communities without sewer and water. and here it is. This is all of the communities that are listed. We verified with all of them. They do not have municipal sewer and water. Once again, the lowest is down about 60 cents. The highest is about $1.60, which guess what? That's where we're at. And the average is the blue line in the middle, which is probably in the vicinity of about $1.30. We're at the high end of our peer group on this. And of course, what's the punchline? Tell me what the difference is. And here it is. So if you elect to have municipal sewer and water or not, and you assume, since we're already running above the average in our peer group, that we're probably going to do that again, the average cost for communities with municipal sewer and water is in the red, the ones without is in the blue, and we're the black. So your question might want to be, do I want municipal sewer and water? Do I want to pay that cost? And by the way, don't forget you got another 80 cents potentially coming on top of it for road repair and maintenance. Our question to you is, where do you want your community to go? Incremental cost and risk with sewer and water, and Mr. Snedeker is going to follow that up. He has expertise in that field, and all of the risks that come with it. Incremental cost with road repair and maintenance, a potential 50% increase in your taxes. We're already estimated to be at 50% built out, meaning of the developable, buildable land in the village of Richfield, half of it has already been developed. I was surprised by that, but I got convinced that's true. And thinking is that we're going to get to 75% in the foreseeable future. Now, what does that mean to you? That means that there will be 50% more people, there will be 50% more traffic, and there will be higher taxes. The argument that the taxes are going to be lower doesn't fly when you compare it to any other community's data. Do you want to encourage or discourage development? Do you want to encourage by putting in turnpike effect decisions, or do you want to influence by not putting them in? And then last, should development be allowed to continue distributing its fully loaded cost on your shoulders? I need to explain that. If you hire an employee, the first thing that you think about in terms of expense might be his salary. So you hire somebody for $50,000. They're a pretty skilled individual. They're going to cost 50 grand. Well, what other expenses do we have with them? As we're trying to make that decision amongst ourselves about whether or not we do this. Well, you got his employee benefits. Well, how much is that? Well, that's about 10 grand. Anything else? No, not really. Well, okay, so you hire this guy, and then companies become too big, and they have too much expense, and then they start understanding, well, what has happened, and how do we get rid of all of this expense? Well, look at all of the other things that happened when you hired Fred for 50 grand. Not only do you have his salary, not only do you have his benefits, now you have his expense in HR to get him in the system, to get him watched, to get him taken care of. You got all of the labor to associate his complaints about things are not going right, or he doesn't have the right medical coverage, or the insurance company is screwing him up. You have all of that. You have to get him in the accounting system for payroll. You have to get him a desk. You have to get him a computer. You have to get him his office supplies. There is a humongous list of all of these things that people don't think about normally. And it's normally not practical. But here's what you can determine to be true just by looking at what happens to other communities. When they add these new developments and these new subdivisions, or they bring in new businesses under the umbrella that it's going to lower their costs, at the end of the day, when you look at them 5 or 10 years down the road, their costs are higher, they're not lower. And there's an abundance of information to tell you that that's true. I thank you very much for being so patient with me, especially as I stumbled around here. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Snedeker to you. We need just a couple of minutes to go swap out laptops.
Yeah, so if you want to stand up and get the circulation going on your buns, please do that while we switch over.